Lou, do you want the good news or the bad news?
Dealer's choice?
Fine. Make me do all the work. I found out today that my parents and I are moving, and guess where?
Wait, is that the good news or the bad news?
Who cares, Lou? Guess!
Did your dad finally get that downtown loft he's been interested in?
No. I guess I'll just tell you. It's gonna be kind of sad, though, because it's not Austin. Or even in Texas.
So you're really moving? Like, new life moving?
Yeah. I'm sorry, Lou. It sucks for me, too. I mean, I was just starting to get to that point where I could walk down the halls without at least one person asking if I worshiped the devil, or if my dad's name was Gomez.
It's weird that kids in 2016 would use the Addams family to insult you.
It's kind of cool, though. I mean, we're moving to New Orleans. You could totally come visit. Show me around.
Why are you moving?
Tell you what, Lou. Come over, have dinner with me and my family tonight, and I'll tell you all about it.
And dinner with Viviana. Okay. It's on my to-day list.
You wrote down what you're going to do in less than 2 hours?
It was more to validate the statement. That night, Lou dined with Viv and her parents. He'd met them a time or two during his friendship with their daughter, and while they were a bit strange, they were also kind and supportive towards her interests. Her father, a huge man named Casper, explained that his latest art exhibit, simulated murder scene on the streets of downtown Austin, had gone quite poorly. The property management firm who held Casper's lease had received massive public pressure to evict the man, and finally, the powers that he paid rent to caved in. They'd agreed to refund Viv's dad the entirety of what he'd already paid them in rent for the year, plus throw in a sizable check to cover relocation, if Casper would sign a contract agreement not to contest the eviction. Casper felt that he could likely do far more than that. He could probably sue them for breaching their end of the deal, considering that he'd done nothing that violated his rental contract. Casper, however, was not the sue-happy type. He accepted their deal. He and his family decided they'd try New Orleans next. What in particular made you pick New Orleans? Lou asked. Well, for starters, it's close, and it has a great art scene, but I'm sure you know that already. And from what I've read and the contacts that I've spoken to down there, the local crowd might be a bit more accepting to our, uniqueness. Vivian smiled and added, he means our weirdness. Renee Alexander, Viv's mom, asked Lou, so what part of town should we move to? So far, we've researched homes in the French Quarter, the Bywater, New Orleans East. I mean, I know crime can be bad there. So what's a middle ground? Well, you'll spend a fortune on a tiny apartment in the French Quarter. Plus, parking's a nightmare down there, and the crowds go all night sometimes. So if you do any art, from home, and you like to have peace of quiet, I'd avoid that. Bywater has sort of become a hipster attraction, so it might fit for your work. New Orleans East, though, that's where Jeff and I grew up. I miss it. After dinner concluded that night, Lou and Viviana took a walk down our street together. I wish you guys could just stay in Austin. Thanks to you, I've made some friends here, but you're my closest, he said to her. I know. I want to be excited about the move. I've always wanted to go to New Orleans, but every time I try to get really happy about it, I think about leaving you behind. Lou, I honestly didn't know if I'd make a single friend this year, and on that first day when we met, well, I really thought I'd ruin any chance of us being friends when I brought up your past so quickly. Viv, you were the first person that wasn't a therapist, journalist, or adult relative that recognized me and treated me like someone they actually wanted to get to know. Remember how Logan was at first? I've been dealing with that all year. If you hadn't got me to talk about it, I still want you to write that book. Please, Lou. I even thought of a title you might like. Jeffrey Woods, brother, friend, killer. I hope that killer part doesn't sound too harsh. You can name it whatever you want, of course, but I wanted to give you a real contribution while we still had time. Well, that's going to be the title then. No questions about it. Love it. And Lou? You can still email, talk on the phone, and Facebook. I want regular updates on the book, too. Don't go getting famous and forgetting little Viv here. I could never forget you. Of course, I'll bug the hell out of you on the internet. Viviana laughed, and they stopped at the corner. They'd walked a bit, and Lou knew that if they didn't turn around now, they might walk all the way to New Orleans, chatting the whole time. Viviana, I know we're close friends, and Lou stopped mid-sentence. He wanted to express to her that he'd grown a bit closer to her than just good friends, but he was also worried that he could ruin what was the first real friend that he'd made since Jeff vanished. Lou? She replied, her voice dropping to a soft tone. You survived Mandeville. You walked out of your house alive. You're Lou Woods, future best-selling author and all-around amazing person. If you want to kiss me, do it. I like you too. I have for some time. If I'd known that we were going to move so quickly, I would have told you much earlier. That night, Lou Woods received his first real kiss. He and Viv embraced for several moments before she pulled back and began to giggle. Am I that bad of a kisser? He asked her. No. I just realized that someone is over there watching us. That guy must have come out to check his mail or something. See? Lou looked down the street in the direction of Viv's pointed finger and saw that about a block away was a figure standing on the sidewalk. Due to the distance, he couldn't make out any features. Couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. He's still staring at us, Lou said in a flat voice, more to himself than to Viv. Lou focused harder and thought that he could make out something on the person's face. As he stared, Viviana tapped his shoulder. Lou, look past the guy, to his left, where the road ends and those bushes are. Does that look like another guy dressed the same? I think I see him, yeah. Shit, you're right. They're identical. Lou, look over there, behind that red car, on the left side of the street. He trained his eyes on the area she pointed and saw a third individual, also playing the statue game. Then he spotted a fourth, another clone stepping out of the darkened bushes. Viv grabbed Lou's arm and whispered in his ear in a harsh voice, I see two more. They're standing in that yard, with a chain-link fence over there. To Lou, this entire scene reminded him of home, when he and Jeff were growing up in Walnut Square. There were some older kids that would sometimes beat up the younger children in the neighborhood, and his current situation reminded him of how it would typically go down. Getting jumped, as it was known, would involve the older kids blocking in their victims by some sort of forming of perimeter. No matter where he might try to run, someone much bigger and stronger would be there. He and Jeff could always tell when it was about to happen, just from the way the aggressors would sort of stand back and wait. Finally, whichever one of the assholes had come up with the idea would make a move, and the rest would close in. Lou looked up the street in the direction of Viv's house to see if more were waiting, closing them in. But he saw no one. Okay. Viviana? We start walking. We walk fast, but don't run. If they're after us, we start sprinting, they'll do the same. I don't know how fast you are, but I know I can't run from here to your house without stopping, and maybe those guys behind us are all fucking track stars, so we power walk, okay? They start following, we just watch how far back they're staying. If they close in, we start running our asses off, and we just hope that we get to your place before we completely run out of steam. Lou, I'm wearing freaking moon boots. I don't know if I can run at all in these. Okay, we power walk then. If they start charging, we start screaming. We can just run up to one of the houses and start banging on the door if we have to. Lou took another quick glance and confirmed that the silent figures had yet to move. He didn't take the time to verify, but from his brief assessment, he estimated there were at least 8 of them, all dressed in identical clothing. They were wearing black hooded sweatshirts and black pants. All had their hoods pulled up, turning their faces into mysteries in the darkness. Lou still believed he saw something, though, but with the poor lighting, it was difficult to say exactly what. It looked like something was painted on its face, though. "Let's move," Lou stated with an authority, and took Vivian by the hand. No sooner did they move than the group of shadowy figures began to move as well. They walked slowly, almost matching Lou's pace. He began to walk faster, and when he'd cast his head back in their direction, he noticed they too picked up their speed. "Fuck it, Lou. I'll run in the boots," Viviana declared, and they both began to run, Lou maintaining his grip on her hand. She was indeed slowing them down quite badly, but he wasn't going to leave her. Just as he began to debate the merits of possibly attempting to run while carrying Vivian, 2 more hooded people moved quickly from behind a parked car and into the street to block them. As Lou turned to consider charging up to a porch, the remainder of the group arrived. He and Viv were now surrounded. Now that the entire freak show was up close, he could see what was on their faces. They were all wearing solid white masks. 2 eye holes appeared perfectly round. A single rectangular slit served as the mouth. He saw that a red substance, what he thought looked like blood, was smeared across each mask. "What do you want?" Lou demanded. "Hello," it replied. He was a man, which was obvious by the voice. "Let us go or I'll scream," Viviana stated. The masked speaker pointed towards the first of the 4 homes that surrounded them. "For sale. On vacation. An elderly woman with a hearing aid." He completed pointing to each location and giving them its occupancy status, then turned his attention back to his victims. Lou once again asked, this time in a voice slightly less confident, what it was that they wanted. "Did you like seeing their dead bodies?" the man asked. "Did you see them laying there, covered in blood? Did it make you happy?" Lou was thunderstruck. Did these people know who he was? Were they after him for what Jeff did? "Look, I didn't have anything to do with it. I tried to warn them," Lou stammered. "They wouldn't listen." "Do they even have names? Can you show the dead at least the respect of calling them by their names?" he screamed. "Yes! Mom, Dad, Donald Williamson, Troy, Keith, and the reporter, Rosenberg." 2 of the masked figures looked at each other, then tilted their heads a bit. "Naming them changes nothing. We will not have you here. We shall not allow such evil to enter our community." The man drew a knife, and as if on cue, the rest did as well. Lou tried to position himself in front of Viv, but they were surrounded. He raised his hands, but against such odds, could not muster the will to try to fight. Please, don't hurt her. Okay, don't hurt either of us. I can't help what Jeff did. I tried to help him. I tried to help them all." "Too late. You must pay. It's time. Go to another city." Finally, the entire street was lit up with blinding lights of a motorist's high beams and the deafening sound of a horn. The speaker of the group turned, dropped his knife, and began to try to rally his group into the intersection. The car drove around them and quickly came to a halt, blocking much of the street. "Mom! Dad!" Vivian exclaimed with joy. Casper threw open the driver's door and reached for the first retreating body that his strong hands could grasp. He was able to catch one of them. There was no struggle as the huge artist slammed his prey onto the side of his car. The rest were fleeing. Lou reached over and picked up the knife that had been dropped. It was rubber. Fake. Just a prop you'd find at a Halloween store. Lou looked back up and saw that Casper had removed the mask. The attacker was a young man, probably only a few years older than Lou and Viv. Perhaps it was the very youthful appearance of the now detained man that calmed Casper down enough to prevent him from smashing his head into the side of his car. "What the fuck are you doing to my daughter?" Casper demanded. It wasn't my idea, sir. I was just part of the pastor's group. He said that we were just going to scare your daughter so that you wouldn't open up your gallery in Austin again. I'm so sorry. Please, no one was going to get hurt. Not anyone. I swear. As Lou heard this, the whole story came together. These men weren't after him. They were after Viviana. All the talk about dead bodies and blood had been in reference to Casper's exhibit. He felt relief running through his body, but he also felt something else. Exposed. Over the past several months since he'd started telling his story, he began each day to feel a little more whole. He'd allowed himself to believe on some level that this was enough. However, after his breakdown in the street, all those emotions were not just brought back, but were also altered in some terrible way. All this time, he'd allowed himself to believe that he and Jeff were both victims in some way. Victims of neglect, victims of bullying, and just plain old victims of circumstance in general. Now he felt different. He could have done more. On the night that his family returned home from the hospital with Jeff, he'd immediately noticed his brother's mental state. The disfigured boy, admiring his face in the mirror, barely felt like the same person he'd grown up with his entire life. He knew that something was terribly wrong. He felt it strongly enough that he risked knocking on his parents' closed door. Cardinal sin in the Woods home for sure. When his parents told him to leave, he'd given up. He could have continued to knock. He could have demanded to at least speak with his father. After their chat at the hospital, Lou had felt that a renewed bond with his dad had been formed. He could have done something more than simply returning to his bedroom and eventually falling asleep. The sound of approaching police sirens broke Lou's dreadful reflection. The police arrived and the familiar song and dance took place. Lou and Viviana gave their accounts of what happened. Casper explained to the officers that he'd become worried that his Viv and Lou were gone so long on what was supposed to be a short walk up the block. The final statements came from the former masked boogeyman that was now just a sniveling and terrified boy, really. His name was Joshua Paris. He was 18. By the time the smoke settled and Casper finally returned from the police precinct, the whole story was out. And it was something that Viviana's father had apparently been dealing with for some time. It turned out to be the work of the East Austin Holy Book, a non-denominational Church of Christ that was known for its outspoken politics and frequent boycotts and protests. Casper had been keeping this information from his wife and daughter so as to not worry them. He explained they'd started to harass him several weeks ago due to the nature of his art. They demanded that he close his gallery, or else. Casper had called their bluff, and when they continued to send in church members posing as customers, members would browse until there was a good number of clients in the gallery, and then begin ranting and raving like a Puritan minister. Casper even admitted to Renee, which earned him a dirty look and a slap on the back of his head, that he'd intentionally increased the gore factor of his latest exhibit just to piss this church off. That had cost him, though, as his over-the-top display of death and gore gave the community enough concern to join in with the Holy Book Church in pressuring the property owner to remove Casper from the building. The little stunt tonight was meant to scare Casper away from Austin, more than likely. So that kid I roughed up tonight, Joshua. The detectives already told me that he was making a deal with the district attorney. The kid's young, and according to his parents, who thankfully were not members of this church as well, told me that he'd already been awarded a full-ride scholarship to Texas Tech. The detectives didn't even have to lean on him very hard. He was ready to make any deal so long as he stayed out of jail and still got to attend college. From what I've been told, this pastor, Buddy Carter, he's been known for doing this kind of shit in the past. This time, though, they have a solid couple of witnesses, and of course, Mr. Texas Tech Joshua's testimony. I don't know. They think they can get him for real. For a moment, Lou felt a rise in joy. If they had to go through a trial, then perhaps they'd stay in Austin. Mr. Casper, does this mean that you're not going to move? Lou asked. His momentary euphoria shattered upon hearing Casper's response. No, Lou, I'm really sorry, but it actually is quite the opposite. We're going to pull Viv from school tomorrow. While I was waiting down at the precinct, I went ahead and closed a quick rental deal with some apartments in New Orleans East, so it looks like you have the best suggestions. Casper's attempt at putting a positive note on the situation was appreciated, but Lou was too disappointed to benefit from it all. So when are you leaving? Renee answered as she'd been working the logistics while Casper was downtown. Tomorrow evening. Viv's face showed a shock and made Lou's melancholy accelerate. Mom, how can we even do that? We have nothing packed. I'm not enrolled in school down there. I mean, come on, I have a biology paper due in 2 days, and... She looked briefly at Lou. And I have other important matters here. I mean, please, Mom, can't we just wait? Casper answered for his wife. Sweetheart, listen. We can't stay here with this batshit church running around there. Even if they arrest the pastor, that doesn't mean other people might not come after us. I can't bear the thought of you being attacked like that again, and if they threaten 2 kids with bloody masks and fake knives because of an art exhibit, I don't want to think what they might do in retaliation for having their leader arrested. But Dad! Casper's voice raised a notch, an action he so rarely took against his daughter that she jumped a bit at first. Viviana! This is the part where you have to just listen. You know your mother and I respect you as an equal in most things, but this is a time where you have to be the child and we have to be the parents. We're pulling you from school tomorrow. You may have to miss a couple weeks while we get you set up in New Orleans, but that's okay. We won't make you go to summer school or anything like that unless you want to. We're going to Lake Charles tomorrow. It's 3 hours away from New Orleans. We have friends of mine there from the art scene. He has an extra studio. It's currently vacant. He's going to let us store all of our things in there, and we can live in a loft above it until we have things all ready to roll in New Orleans, and I'll have to sell a lot of our personal collection to raise the money to get the gallery running in New Orleans, and I doubt that I'll get nearly as good a deal as if I would have if we waited, but I cannot, and I will not, put my family in danger. Lou... Can Lou spend the night? She asked, not directing the question to any parent in particular. I don't think that's really appropriate, Viv, Renee answered. Lou could tell by the sound of her voice that it was likely a rare moment in Alexander's home when they were at odds with their daughter. He can sleep on the couch. I mean, we're not going to do anything, I promise, but... Viviana broke down in tears and collapsed into a sitting position on the floor. Lou hated to see her like this, but he didn't know what to say to make it any better. As he pondered any useful words, Casper tapped his shoulder and asked him to talk privately in the kitchen. Lou nodded. Tonight, Lou. Tonight you attempted to stand between men with knives and my daughter. I never imagined anyone willing to do something like that besides Renee or myself. You are a remarkable kid, and... Well, I started thinking out there that you and Viviana... You seem to have a very solid friendship, and I'd be willing to bet that friendship's not where it's going to end. This comment caused Lou to blush. Well, sir, I mean, I like your daughter, like a great friend, but also, I mean, she... Casper held up a hand and gestured for Lou to pause. Lou, you and Viviana like each other. It's okay. As I said before, you've shown more courage and valor as a teenager than a lot of adults I know would ever demonstrate. And believe me, Viviana talks about you all the time here. We knew that she saw you as more than just a friend when she couldn't help but smile each and every time her phone rang and your name was on the screen. So, here is what I'm proposing. Come back with us. Back to New Orleans. Obviously, we'd have to run it through the proper channels. Your legal guardians would have to approve, as with the courts, and they'd have to pull you from school. I mean, it's a lot. But look, I heard the way your voice became so down when you were telling us about your old neighborhood. After all you've been through, I know you must be homesick as well. That place you told me about, Walnut Square, the apartment I got us is a couple blocks away. Hasn't even been 2 years since you moved from there, right? Bet most of your old friends are still there. I mean, that would be good for Viviana. I think it would be good for you. I guess what I'm saying, son, is you looking out for Viv tonight isn't the only reason I'm inviting you. I can't imagine what it was like to live through what you did. You deserve a fresh start. A real fresh start. Not out here in Austin with distant relatives. Back at home. I don't know if you and Viviana are destined for romance or not. But even if you two decide to just stay friends, you're still welcome to be a part of our family. If you two do end up dating, at least I know my daughter has a boyfriend that I don't have to polish my gun in front of just to make sure that he treats her right. So, I know you need some time to think on it. What are your thoughts on the offer? Lou gave a brief smile and nodded with conviction. That could be good, I guess, he said, with no faith that his forced response carried any credibility as truth. Casper clearly picked up on it. When he spoke again, he did not attempt to sell the idea any further. Instead, he handed Lou one of his business cards and told him that if he was interested in taking them up on the offer, to have his aunt and uncle call him up, then they could begin the process of working it out. They shook hands. Lou hadn't planned to leave so soon when he and Casper walked into the kitchen, nor had Casper intended to ask him to go home. He'd actually considered Viv's request and thought that perhaps the couch was a safe enough place. He trusted his daughter, and after tonight, he trusted Lou. However, something hung in the air now, and both knew exactly what it was. Lou clearly was not going to take his offer to come along with his family to New Orleans. Lou himself had no intention to even ask his aunt and uncle about the proposal. He had his reasons, and as much as he desired to spend more time with Viviana, he knew this was not the time to return home. Hey, Casper began. I won't mention the move idea to Viv unless you decide that you want to go for it, you know. I don't want to get her hopes up. Thank you, Lou replied softly. He was trying not to cry in front of the man. Lou and Renee shared a hug. She told him that he was an honorary Alexander for the rest of his life. Viviana and Lou went out to the porch of their home to wait for his uncle to come and pick them up. For almost 10 minutes, they did not speak. Viv's crying had stopped, leaving only random bursts of sobs, and then that stopped as well, with only sniffles and red eyes to remind her that the breakdown was ever there. Lou finally strung together a thought and the words to carry it to his friend. I'm sorry for freaking out tonight when the guys were throwing out all those questions. I thought it was something to do with my brother. Oh, no problem. Honestly, I did too. I didn't know Dad was getting heat from the church all the time. Fuck him. I hope they bust that pastor really soon. Lou, are you really okay? With all the stuff we've been talking about? He sighed. I wanted to talk to her about this, but with the emotions being so new, he wasn't quite sure how to say what he wanted to. I'm always okay when you're around. Even if we're surrounded by idiots with plastic knives. Really, I thought that I was getting over it. Telling the other kids at school did help a lot, and I'll always owe you for that. Don't forget the book title, too, she amended, finally with a tone of voice that, while not happy at least, wasn't completely miserable. Of course, yeah. But to be truthful, I never considered that I could have done so much more than I did. A minute longer of banging on the door, and my parents might still be alive. Jeff could have gotten help. A minute more of knocking at the door, Viv, and who knows? Maybe 6 people wouldn't have died. I don't know, Lou. Sometimes I write these wild little formulas, maybe. Just dumb pseudo-goth crap, like everyone would expect from me. One night I was thinking about the time I got... Oh, promise not to laugh, Lou. Promise. One morning I got hit with a garbage can. The next few seconds were some of the most mentally grueling of Lou's life, as he fought not to fall from the chair in a fit of laughter. He fought hard, though, and after a few seconds that felt like hours went by, his urge to laugh passed. How exactly? It was a Saturday morning, a few years ago. There was this stupid bagel shop about a mile from our house. They opened at 4 a.m. and usually had a line at the door well before. And see, they sold something called a knucklehead. It was some sort of bear claw-looking pastry, and people raved about them. They only made a few dozen every morning, though. And once they ran out, that was it. And so one night, I decided to set my alarm for 3 a.m. and just pedal down there and wait. I wanted a damn knucklehead, Lou, and I was sick of all these early bird donut lovers snatching them all up. So, my alarm goes off at 3, and I hit snooze. It goes off 5 minutes later, and I get up, and I get dressed, and I start riding my bike to the bakery, and as I'm biking, a garbage truck is up ahead doing the typical routine. I get on the sidewalk in order to be a safe distance. Just as I pass the rear of the truck, the trash collector must have just dumped the can. So, you know how they do, they dump the can, they throw the can, and drive to the next house. Well, they changed it up for me. It was dump the can, throw the can into Viviana, and then Viviana goes to the hospital. I got 2 cracked ribs, and it dislocated my shoulder. Damn. Rough morning. But what does that have to do with your little formula or whatever? Well, I started thinking, what if I hadn't hit snooze? Or what if I'd hit snooze a second time? Every impulse in my body was telling me to do it. I'll tell you, the garbage truck would have been somewhere else when I got to that part of the sidewalk. The trash can that ensured I'd never throw the discus in the Olympics would have still been full of trash had I skipped the snooze. Or it would have already been empty if I hit it again. But then I started realizing that I could trace it back even further. When my alarm went off the first time, I almost just turned it off. I mean, it's Saturday morning. Is some pastry really worth torturing myself into clothes? Had I not gone out that morning at all, I too could be in a totally different place right now. Or my bike. I had to pump up the tires on it the night before. Something I would have done sooner, but my dad broke out our air pump. It just happened that someone threw one away a couple of days before in the dumpster behind my dad's gallery. He noticed it there, and when he saw it, it still functioned. So he brought it home. My dad only went out to the dumpster to run to the trash because his clerk called in sick that day. So had my dad not brought the pump home, I wouldn't have been able to fill my tires, and that also would have changed everything. And anyway, I just kept going with it, diving back deeper and deeper, and finally I Googled the history of the little bagel shop. Turns out that the 2 original owners met because one of them bent down to pick up a nickel from the sidewalk, but before doing, asked someone to please hold his briefcase. A helpful guy that happened to be an investor looking for ideas happened to be there and offered to hold the case. They got to talking after that, and eventually they founded the bagel place. So it was this. Imagine if whoever dropped that nickel back in 1945 or something had noticed it and picked it up. Or what if the other bagel guy hadn't had time to hold the briefcase? Or what if the first guy just didn't notice the nickel? No matter what, it likely would have meant no bagel shop, and thus no place for me to wake up at 3 a.m. for. Think about it, Lou. I had to wrap my ribs like a mummy and never pick up anything heavy and miss a ton of school, all because back in 1945, some guy dropped a nickel on the ground. Wow. That's deep, Viv. I can't tell if you're being sarcastic or not, but Lou, what I'm saying is that some things that we think just happened because of whatever may already be set in motion anyway. If you'd managed to get your parents to come to the door, maybe they would have gone to check on Lou. Maybe they would have sent him back to the hospital. Or maybe he would have just refused to tell them anything and they would have gone right back to their room thinking he was fine. That's how blame works, Lou. You go back to one point in time when you had some kind of control and you put yourself into this position of godhood. But all this stuff happens because of things that had already happened. If Randy's dad had locked up the flare gun, none of this would have happened. If Randy's mom had been on birth control, none of this would have happened. If your dad hadn't been offered the promotion and a job in Mandeville, maybe. I mean, you can trace it back to Randy's great-great-grandparents meeting for the first time if you want. The present adds up no matter what, Lou. And it always will. Lou stared at the young woman still sitting next to him. In that moment, he decided that he loved her. "You're the best person I've ever known," he told her. Tears danced in his eyes. She leaned into him and the two embraced in a slow and gentle kiss that lasted until the sound of an approaching vehicle, Lou's ride, interrupted their shared affection. "Come see me tomorrow. Come see me before I leave tomorrow. Okay, Lou? I'll be here. Good night, Viv. He almost said that he loved her. However, to express such a profound truth and then immediately drive off seemed as though it would cheapen the deal. This wasn't some corny romantic comedy where such absurd actions were considered cute and were accompanied by a light-hearted soundtrack. Lou rode home without speaking very much. His aunt and uncle had about 1,000,000 questions concerning the attack from the church members. Lou played it down as a scare tactic based on them being offended by an art exhibit. Still, he told the same story and answered the same questions over and over again until their guardians gave in to their age and the lateness of the hour. They retired to bed, and Lou began to write his book. Once he began to allow the words to flow, the story being told line by line, truth by truth, and pain by pain, he found that he didn't want to stop. It wouldn't be until the sun itself began to lighten the sky that he realized he'd been up all night. He was tired, but felt a pang of regret the moment that he saved and closed the file. As soon as it was gone from his screen, he wanted it back. There was still so much to tell. He climbed into his bed and closed his eyes, feeling almost certain that he wouldn't be able to sleep. As he lay still, allowing his mind to wander and ponder, his mind went to Viviana. He loved her. He knew that to be a truth and not a product of a youthful optimism. He wanted to be with her no matter what, no matter where. He felt a touch of guilt at turning down Casper's offer as he did. Viv's dad had most likely expected Lou to be thrilled at the chance to move back home. Lou loved his aunt and uncle and was appreciative they took him in. but he also felt like a constant guest in their house. A welcomed guest, sure, but a guest is a guest. He understood that he would essentially still be a guest in the Alexander home, but with their acceptance of the growing relationship with their daughter, perhaps it would be more like family. He could show Viv around his old neighborhood, introduce her to his old friends, and eventually take her out to Mandeville and show her where the infamous crimes occurred, the ones that shattered his life. He might even say something sweet to her, tell her how he was indeed shattered until he found her and she put him back together. He smiled at that, and decided at that moment that he would apologize to Casper and accept the offer. If he were lucky, maybe they'd keep Viviana in Austin for another couple of days, as Casper and Renee would have to hammer out a lot of details with Lou's guardians. He also decided that he would tell Viv as soon as he saw her that he loved her. No waiting. He was Lou Woods, a survivor, as Viv herself assured him. He was not weak. He should not be afraid of life. Sleep finally took Lou, as he was imagining his life to be with Viv and her parents in New Orleans East. He drifted off knowing that his old life, home, and peace of mind would soon return. When he awoke sometime later, he had an immediate feeling that something was wrong. The sunlight that illuminated his room was too bright. He sat up and struggled to focus his newly awakened eyes on the digital clock on his desk. When he finally was able to see the time, an immediate cocktail of regret and panic rose in him. It was after 3 p.m., late into the afternoon. Lou fumbled about his nightstand until he found his cell phone, and he was further horrified to see that he'd failed to charge it the night before. It was dead. He rolled out of bed quickly, placed the phone on its charger. It would still be a few minutes, though, before it had enough juice to come on and stay on. He sat down at his computer desk and opened his email. What he feared was waiting. Email from Viviana Alexander to Lou Woods. Dear Lou, I tried to get my parents to wait longer, but eventually they said that we had to get on the road. I'm not angry, so no worries. I guess something came up. We were attacked last night by crazy people after all, lol. And don't feel guilty. We'll talk on the phone and stuff real soon, and if you feel guilty about not getting to say goodbye in person, don't, okay? We had a beautiful goodbye on my porch last night. I'm not sure if I could top that anyway. Get your mind out of the gutter, lol. So we can always say that our first goodbye was on a high note. I can't wait for you to come down to New Orleans and visit. Well, I'm gonna go. Call when you can. Viv. The timestamp on the email showed that it was sent 2 hours ago. Regardless, Lou rushed to throw on clothes and race downstairs. His uncle, a man old enough to be mistaken for a younger grandfather, was sitting at the kitchen table, sort of just staring off. Uncle Mark, can you drive me over to Viviana's house? Where you picked me up last night? Oh, you're waiting to go and say goodbye? Yes, please. I think they might have left already, but they might still be packing. Can you please take me over there? I wish I could, Lou, but your aunt has the car. Well, she went shopping. Knowing that woman, she won't be home until late. Just take the bus. That house ain't too far away. Lou looked down at his feet and felt the heat of frustration. He had no idea how the bus system in Austin ran. In New Orleans, he could have mapped that city from end to end by the way of the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority. In Austin, though, he'd be lost by the first intersection. Uncle Mark, I don't know the bus route. Lou's uncle frowned in empathy. Do you know the address? I think I can spare a cab fare if you don't tell your aunt that I'm just handing out her money. Lou realized that he didn't know the address at all. He knew her neighborhood, though, a subdivision called Glenshire. All the streets had Renaissance-style names. If he could get there, he's quite certain that he could find her home. Okay, yeah, that sounds great, Lou stated with enthusiasm that felt very artificial. While his uncle fished out a couple of $20 bills, Lou called the first cab company his phone's Google app produced and got the ball rolling. As he did this, though, trying to feel excited about the prospect of seeing her, his mind was scolding him as though he was the dumbest human being alive. Just call her, his mind demanded. If she's still home, you can actually tell her to wait and increase your odds. Plus, it'll save you a cab ride. True logic if there ever was. However, Lou needed the slight chance right now. As long as he remained intentionally naive, the hope that she was still home remained real, even if it was highly misguided and unlikely. At the core of it all, if Lou actually believed that she was still there, he'd call her and ask her to wait. Lou and Jeff grew up in an environment of constant disappointment, though, from their parents to themselves, become far too skilled at detecting bad outcomes. He knew she was most likely halfway to the Louisiana state line if Casper drove fast. The truth, though, was ugly and cruel. Gave no shelter, cared not for the feelings of a lovesick teenager. The lie, though. The lie he told himself, well, that provided hope. That lie allowed Lou to imagine his cab pulling up as Viviana was perhaps just sitting outside with a box or a bag in her arms, bringing whatever they could to the car while the rest would be packed up later. He imagined that she looked up and see the cab, dismissing it at first, but then quickly snapping back, eyes growing wide, smile growing more radiant as she locked eyes with him. The cab would stop on the curb and she'd already be racing over. He shoved the cash in the driver's hand, jumping out without concerning himself with change. They would hug, she would laugh and scold him for oversleeping. He would tell her that he loved her and hoped that she maintained her joy. He would tell her about Casper's offer that he wanted to take. She'd be overjoyed and hug him even harder. He and Casper would talk again, this time with Viv in attendance. He wouldn't leave with them today, but plans would be set in motion soon enough, and he and Viviana would be walking down Crowder Boulevard in New Orleans East, together, hand in hand. That was the lie that prevented Lou from conducting a simple and surefire method to save him both time and money, because saving the time and money were components of the same cold reality where his parents were dead, and his brother was an insane monster. The lie was where he decided to take shelter until the cold truth would inevitably find him. After what seemed like an eternity, the cab finally pulled up. Lou's uncle made the same joke for the 10th time since the cab was requested. "Calm down, Lou. She's still gonna be pretty when you get there." He told Lou that he'd spotted them kissing as they pulled up the night before, but didn't want to embarrass him in front of his aunt. Lou thanked him for his discretion, though he was sure that his aunt saw too, and was met with the same wink and smile that his uncle always employed when discussing the matters of the real world, as he called them. Mark had allowed Lou to drink a beer once, and damn near winked and smiled at every sip. However, he was a kind man who treated his nephew like an adult for the most part, and considering how easily Lou could have ended up as Aunt Marcy's house in Alberta Springs, he counted this as a blessing each and every time. The cab ride was almost as unbearable as the wait to be picked up. The driver seemed to catch every single red light, every yellow light that even the most elderly of drivers would likely pass up. This driver apparently stopped for everything. He seemed to always teeter just under the speed limit and would slow down and wave any car in that was waiting to exit a parking lot. Lou considered that he might just have found the world's only courteous and safe taxi driver. As nice as this rare find might be in a normal situation, he currently found himself practically crawling out of his skin, though. He wanted to scream for the driver to hurry up. Each time the cab took a long and slow halt to meet the commands of a stop sign or reduce speed to a crawl to take a turn, Lou wondered if perhaps he didn't contract some of Jeff's insanity, like an airborne virus. Initially, Lou had told the man to drop him at the gates of Glenshire Housing Subdivision, but upon seeing the place, finally, he felt confident that he could actually guide the driver there. He'd turned out to be right. The subdivision was smartly developed with easy-to-remember landmarks and a simple grid of streets with no surprises or dead ends. When Lou saw Capulet Street, a fitting name since he was in the pursuit of love, though thankfully not contested like the street's namesake, he asked the driver to let him out here. Viv's house was around the middle, and Lou could walk it in less than 2 minutes. The truth, though, was that Lou, already knowing he'd be walking up to a vacant house, knew that he'd want some time by himself to digest the sadness that would follow. He most certainly didn't want to break down into tears, and while he was pretty confident that he wouldn't, he didn't want to risk it in front of a stranger. If Viv wasn't there, he'd just walk for a bit, let his mind work around his folly of oversleeping and missing her call, and he'd just call for another cab and go home. After paying the cabbie, Lou began the brisk walk to Viv's house. He almost wished the walk could be a bit longer. He was safe in his lie still. Once the house was in sight, he immediately felt his hope drop to near extinction. Casper's huge sedan wasn't in the driveway. Already strike one, and Lou hadn't even stepped on the porch yet. He saw the porch light wasn't on, although twilight was approaching, and didn't see any lights from the windows. Strike two. Preparing for the final strike, before getting sent back to the dugout, Lou was actually amazed when he saw the front door was not closed. The door was halfway open, which in his experience was the standard sign of people moving out or into a house. Since all their large possessions were still inside, the door wouldn't be open unless they were home. Lou's mind returned, although with caution, to his imagined world that carried him to sleep last night. He'd knock on the door while allowing it to swing open a bit more. He'd probably hear music playing as Viv threw together the last essentials that she'd needed. She'd light up with joy as she realized who was at the door. And maybe Casper had taken the car out to get some provisions for the road. Maybe he'd gone down to make sure the gas tank was full and the tires were fully inflated. Either way, Lou didn't care. Upon reaching the door, though, Lou began to doubt his second chance, and that cautious optimism that fueled his daydream diminished quickly. Lou knocked, but received no response. Looking through the partially open door showed Lou a dark house. There were no lights on, and no sounds of music or television. The place simply screamed empty. So why the open door? Surely they weren't in such a rush to leave town that they left all their possessions unsecured. Lou didn't think a robbery was taking place either. Growing up in New Orleans, he'd seen a few going down from time to time. There was no vehicle to load the stolen goods into, no lookout man to make sure the neighbors weren't getting nosy, and from what he could tell by looking at the door, there's no sign of forced entry. Ignoring his increasing sense that something here was wrong in favor of the still lingering hope that Viviana might be just inside, Lou opened the door completely and knocked loudly on its wooden surface. It's me, Lou! Is anyone home? No response. He peered further inside and could still find no sign of activity. He knocked again, louder than the first time, and once again called out. No response. When his cell phone began to ring loudly from his back pocket, Lou jumped a bit in surprise. The silence had crept up around him so slowly that his ringtone sounded as though speakers amplified it. He looked at the screen and saw that Viv was calling him. His mind took no time to indulge in the fantasy that perhaps she was upstairs or in the backyard. Instead, he just hit the talk button and hoped for a miracle. Viv, hey, believe it or not, I'm actually at your... Her voice, frantic, replied. I know, Lou, I started getting these weird videos. Look, you have to get out of there. You're in danger. What do you mean? About 10 minutes ago, my parents and I started receiving these weird videos. Someone out there, they got our information or something. They sent us a video of them walking around in our house, looking through our things, and then just a minute ago, I received a video from them. Here, I'm sending it, but don't stand there and watch it. Start calling for help or something. Lou was far too enraptured both in her story and in that sense of safety that anyone standing outside on a clean street in a nice neighborhood with adequate sunlight to follow the good advice that Viv was providing. He did back up a few steps from the open door, but the front yard was empty and he was sure he could hear a lawnmower nearby. The environment simply defined safety, and Lou's intellectual mind could seemingly not move forward unless it was assisted by real fear. As he waited for the video to start, he asked the most important question he could imagine. Viviana, are you and your parents okay? Her voice was growing more impatient with each response. Yes, Lou, we're almost to the state line. Are you looking for help? Are you knocking on doors? Come on, Lou, the video. They're watching. Lou looked back to his screen, and suddenly, the fear came fast and without mercy. The video Viv sent him showed a replay of the last 5 minutes of his life. The video, which appeared to have been shot from across the street in the cover of bushes, was Lou, walking towards Viv's house. He watched himself slowly approach her porch, saw how he'd slowed down in reaction to the open door, then watched as he climbed the steps and eventually began knocking. The video cut off at that point. He raised the phone back to his head, finally intending to turn and run to the next house, following the same game plan that he'd devised the night before to bang on doors and scream. "Did you call the police?" he asked her. The voice from behind him, almost in his ear. "They'll never make it in time." Before Lou could turn, he was struck in the head. He didn't know by what, but he recalled the strange sensation that came with the blow. He realized, in a thought process that felt very slippery and difficult to follow, that he'd dropped his phone. He watched it drift slowly to the ground. He felt his knees buckle just slightly before blacking out. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video. Or listening to tonight's podcast on the podcast, if you're listening to that there at Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever you could happen to listen to podcasts. I wanted to remind you guys also that my wife sells loose leaf tea at etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocletea. She has different teas, including Creepypasta teas, and you can get a Mr. Creepypasta tea. If you ask for a dabbing sticker, she also has those. And of course, I wanted to give a big thank you to everyone who checks out patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta and supports the show, keeps the light on, gives me treats for my now 2 cats, both Hylas and Hercules. Both of them are a handful. And especially a big thank you to Saha, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Mazikeen, Ken Lando Higuchi, Chompski, Nico kaeo, Tristain Pelton, Stephen VanHuss, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, G. Weevil 3, TheRedOakShieldVirus, Hades' Nephew, Carter Barenfanger, Dr. Strawberry, Jordan Wayne Deckard, Bradney Leipe, The Government Monitoring System, Anne Charron, rumblefox, AcidSystem, Mike Bullock, Raphael Rodriguez, Dan Sweet, Mad Marstomp, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Sean Mills, Brian Arce, Cryptic Nightmares, Shadow Morningstar, Somber Puppet, Brianna Wright, Someone You Love, Said the King 56, Bad Honey, S-Man, Kiri the Sloth, Patrick Schoolmeister, Thomas Burgett, Barbara Maceo, Bobby Carmen, Liam Newman, The Homeless Bird 93, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Last Blade Song, Eliminator 86, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, and Corey X Kenshin. A big thank you to all of you guys and everybody down there in the description. I really can't thank you guys enough for supporting the show. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And everybody who listens, sweet dreams.